So what if the assumptions aren't met for a test? And if the assumptions are not met for a parametric test, and this is usually around assuming that they are normal or that we want to test the means, then we can use a non-parametric test. So we aren't assuming anything about the shape, and because we aren't assuming anything about the shape, it doesn't make any sense to test the mean, which is sensitive to a lot of these problems which make it not normal. So we can test if the shape is the same between the two groups, and this is the distribution. And we can also test if the center is the same. And usually this is done by the median. If you want to get very technical, if you've got more of a math background, you could look up mean ranks. And because there's a few different ways of approaching it. But we're just going to look at it as being a test of the shape and a test of the center or the median. So I should say here that if you're not familiar with the difference between what a mean is and what a median is, I encourage you to go back to, now it might be week 2, one of the early weeks I had some notes in about that, but you can also just Google it because it's a wonderful resource. What is a mean, median and mode, which you will have done at high school at some point. So we might be interested in, is there a difference in the hand grip strength between the genders? And I've helpfully labelled these 1 and 2. So we can't tell who's male and who's female. I expect that you will do a better job than me with labelling your graphs. And we can already see that we have some outliers here, quite a few. And there's 3 numbers here, 7, 42 and 47. So it means 2 of them are on top of each other, and that's why we can only see 2 dots. And then we've got another 3 outliers over here. Again, if we look at them, they're not quite normal. Now, in all honesty, you might get away with doing a t-test on this anyway, but for the sake of argument, you might decide the data's not looking great, let's do a non-parametric test. So for a Mann Whitney U test or a non-parametric test, the assumptions are that your dependent variable should be ordinal or continuous, your independent variable should be 2 categorical independent groups, you should have independence of observations, so these are basically the same as the assumptions for the t-test. And then the last assumption is more of a statement. The Mann Whitney U test can be used when your 2 variables are not normally distributed. So we don't have to check for outliers, we don't have to check for normality, and we don't have to check for equality of variances. And there's a little note in here from Laird where they're describing how it is that we use the same test to test the shape and the median. And here they say if the shape is the same and then you run the test for the center, it's a test of medians. If the 2 distributions have a different shape, then technically what you're comparing is the mean ranks. This is getting quite technical, and I'm quite happy if you ignore this if this is going a little bit too much for you. Shape and center, you can think of it like that. So SPSS actually gives really great output for the non-parametric test, and I feel like this might have been coded by a completely different team because it's very different to the t-tests. So it actually tells us what the null hypothesis is. It tells us the test it's done. It tells us the p-value, which is the significance, and then it tells us what to do. So there's not a huge amount of thinking involved in this. With this output, and you'll see when we do this in the workshops, you can double click on this and it gives you a little bit more information, a nice little picture, and it tells you the means and gives you some other stuff. There are sometimes it, forget it. I was going to say there are some times where it doesn't give you this extra output, but it does. It's just another page on this output it doesn't give you, but we'll worry about that when we get up to it. Forget I said anything. Okay. So if we've tested the shapes and there's no difference in the shapes or the distributions, then we can test the median and the center. And here it says we've actually, when you see how we do this, you'll see we're actually clicking mostly the same buttons. And it will say here it's doing an independent samples medians test. In papers, they'll often just report this as the Mann Whitney U test anyway. And again, there's no difference. It tells you what to do. So there is no difference in the median scores between the genders. This is possibly an unexpected finding if we were expecting that men would be stronger. And we might go back and look at the design of the study. The authors acknowledged that the sample was not random. I think it really was a convenient sample where there was some volunteerism. So perhaps the women who felt stronger were more likely to volunteer. We might want to compare with larger values and see if there is any trend that that men and women do have similar hand grip strength. I actually don't know what we're expecting for that. So that's a quick look through the non-parametric tests. They really are quite easy once you can get your head around what they're doing. In the workshops, we'll have a look at some examples and make sure that everyone can get started using SPSS.